So, without further ado, let's get started. Who is that? Anybody know? How do you know it's Buffalo Bill? Any? The hat, what else? The head? The buffalo head? Yeah. The boots? All those things help you know who that is. Who's that? How many say Buffalo Bill? How many say somebody else? Okay, well, we'll see. There's what the caption says, Buffalo Bill himself. Is that Buffalo Bill himself? We'll find out. So who's that? I mean, that's Buffalo Bill, obviously. That's the man that everybody knows. And again, what are some of the trademarks there that make him instantly recognizable as Buffalo Bill? White hair, mustache, what else? The clothing, the buckskins, what else? Obviously the hat, the whole thing. I mean, that's the picture. And of course, there he is, larger than life. If you haven't gone to our Whitney Gallery of Western Art and walked to the back and looked out at the spectacular view of this marvelous statue, The Scout, by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, that was done in the mid-1920s, please do so. I mean, it is truly a magnificent equestrian statue, a magnificent representation. So who's that? Somebody said Calamity Jane? How about that? So, an 11-year-old boy, I'll give you a hint. How about that? There's somebody said Buffalo Bill. How many think that's Buffalo Bill? There you go. Who's that? That looks like Mr. Moneybags from the Monopoly board game, or maybe Colonel Sanders. I get those guesses a couple of times from people. Well, that raises the question, is it Buffalo Bill himself, or is it William F. Cody? Are they the same? Are they different? There's a business card there for Honorable William F. Cody, and notice down in the lower right he says, in quotes, Buffalo Bill. Here's a quick story for you. This is told by a man named Frank Wilberg, who was an attaché, an American ambassador, and he was in England in 1887. He was at a dinner party for one of William F. Cody's close friends, General Miles. And so Cody hosted this dinner party. Colonel Cody's company was performing at this was actually from 1904, not 1887. Colonel Cody's company was performing at the Olympia Theater. And the dinner party was held at his hotel at an hour early enough to allow ample time for adjournment to the Wild West. A delightful occasion it was. The banquet was served to the most exquisite style, and the droll humor and genial hospitality of the veteran scout and showman added a sauce piquante to every course. Colonel Cody, in evening dress, like that picture we saw just a moment ago, left the table only a few minutes earlier than his guests, for whom the royal box was reserved at the Olympia. A lightning change artist is Buffalo Bill, for scarce had we taken our place in the box when, amid the blare of brass, the picturesque old showman in cowboy attire, his long gray curls fluttering out from below his sombrero, came dashing across the arena on his fleet and graceful steed. An instant later, the beautiful horse stopped short and stood like a statue before us. The grizzled Buffalo Bill, with a majestic sweep of his thin right arm, removed his broad-brimmed hat, and in stentorian tones announced the opening of the greatest show on earth, Buffalo Bill's Wild West and the Rough Riders of the World, precisely as he'd done thousands of times before, and as millions of people had seen him. 'Tis thus he plays his double part, Colonel Cody, Buffalo Bill. So, a man of two parts, William F. Cody and Buffalo Bill. This is a book, it's actually a pretty good book. Some of you may know it. It's on sale in our gift shop. The man, William F. Cody's Wyoming Empire, the Buffalo Bill, nobody knows. It's all about what William F. Cody did here in northwest Wyoming. His business interests and his interest in developing the town. I'll say more about that. I think it's a pretty good book, but I would disagree with him. I don't think it's the Buffalo Bill nobody knows. I think it's the William F. Cody nobody knows. I'm impressed that many of you were able to recognize his name. A year ago, I gave a talk at a government agency here in Cody. I won't identify it for the sake of not embarrassing anybody who might happen to be here, but let's just say it's one of several federal agencies we have here, and they had their history day, so they invited me to come and talk, and so I started off showing a picture of Buffalo Bill and asked who it was, and of course everybody said Buffalo Bill. And then I showed that picture of the bearded man with the business suit, and I said, now who's that? And there was like a minute of silence, and finally somebody said, wasn't his name something like Cody? Well, here we are in the town of Cody. Everybody today, it seems, knows Buffalo Bill, but hardly anybody really knows William F. Cody. A lot of people think they know this individual, Buffalo Bill Cody, whose image appears on a postage stamp that was done a number of years ago. That was when the price of a stamp was 15 cents. I'm not even sure when that was. And this year we now have Buffalo Bill Cody beer. You can buy it around town. Well, here's a news flash. Buffalo Bill Cody never existed. There was never a person named Buffalo Bill Cody. William F. Cody always separated Buffalo Bill from himself. He never ever referred to himself as Buffalo Bill Cody. He always referred to himself as William F. Cody. To his good friends and his relatives, he was known as Will. He would put the name Buffalo Bill on his business card because that was the persona, that was the character that he portrayed. But he never ever thought of himself totally as Buffalo Bill Cody. That's something we have created after his death. So if you leave with anything from this talk, don't let anybody tell you that Buffalo Bill Cody ever existed. It's always William F. Cody and Buffalo Bill. So I've X'd out Buffalo Bill Cody. Let's hope he goes away. So I want to tell you a little bit about this man nobody knows. It seems to me as I walk around town, as I talk to people, that what people do know of William F. Cody tends to be somewhat negative. They talk about him as a womanizer, as a drinker, somebody who was abusive to children. All sorts of stories are told about him, and the truth is that you can indeed find those kinds of things about him. But I think it's also important to recognize him as a full person and to turn the negative into a positive, to really look at him as a real live individual whose life really turns out to be very much like the lives that we ourselves lead. How many of you have ever been in love? How many of you have ever held a job? How many of you have tried something but failed at it? And how many of you have been optimistic that things will get better? How many of you have children? How many of you, God forbid, have lost a child or know somebody who's lost a child? If you can relate to any or all of those things, then he really is just like you. The big guy up on the horse, that persona of Buffalo Bill really is just a persona. It's the real life individual who I think turns out to be very compelling because he is so much like who we are. And in fact, that's really the key message of what we'll be doing with our new Buffalo Bill Museum. That's the storyline in a nutshell. Man of the West, man of the world. About how William F. Cody, as a man of the West, born in the West, spent his first 30 years in the West, how he acquired a nickname because of his skill hunting buffalo, and how that nickname, Buffalo Bill, started him on a trajectory that ultimately made him the most famous person in the world, the first international superstar. But the funny thing is, the best known person in the world was really a persona. It was Buffalo Bill, the persona, that was the best known person. William F. Cody increasingly was finding that his life, his identity, was becoming squelched by this enormous persona of Buffalo Bill. And so at the midpoint in his life, in what we would call a midlife crisis moment, he began to think about what matters. What is life really about? How do any of us measure success? What is meaningful to us? What do we do in our lives to make a difference? And as he thought about it, he began to think, I don't want to be remembered only as Buffalo Bill. You take away the show costumes, you take away the properties, you take away the animals for Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and you get rid of all the other actors, what's left? Nothing. He realized it was ephemeral, it was transitory. When he died, that would die with him. And that's not how he wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be remembered for doing something lasting and tangible. And he also felt this incredible tug of the West, not the Wild West with two capital W's like the show, but a small W, the Wilderness West, the West that he had known and loved. And that, coupled with his desire to find something meaningful in his life, is what brought him back to the West, to come back here and develop the New West. So that's our story, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along here. So let's learn about the man nobody knows. He was born on the west bank of the Mississippi River in 1846. So by his very birth, he was a Westerner. That was, as it is today, the divide between the East and West, and his house actually looked out over the Mississippi River. He was born in this little town in Iowa. He spent about 10 years there, and then his family moved to Missouri, stayed briefly in Missouri, and then made their way to Kansas. And it's really Kansas where William F. Cody spent the first formative years of his life. It's where he had his first job. It's where he acquired his nickname of Buffalo Bill. It's where so many things happened that shaped who he was. He has some wonderful stories in his autobiography, which is also, I'm not trying to put plugs here, but it really is a terrific read. You can buy copies of it in our bookstore. He tells this wonderful story about how he was with his father in 1854 when they went into Kansas for the first time, and they were riding along, came up to the top of this hill, and looked out on this valley. And that image is kind of like the image on the left there. It was filled from one end of the horizon to the other with wagons. Wagon trains making their way across the country. People moving across the United States to find a new life for themselves in the West. He had never seen wagon trains. He was just fascinated by it. A couple of days later, he met some cowboys. He met actually some Mexican cowboys known as vaqueros. And his father started a trading post with Indians as his primary clientele, Kickapoo and Potawatomi and Delaware. And so at this very early age of about 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old, William F. Cody is experiencing things on the frontier and decides, as he says, my love of the plains, my love of life in the plains was the result of my early surroundings. He decides he wants to spend his life working on the plains. One of the images that people have certainly had in his time and still have today of Buffalo Bill is that he was an Indian slayer. And there's a picture in the autobiography on the left. Cody tells a story about the first time he killed an Indian. On the right is a representation of the duel in 1876 with Yellow Hair or Yellow Hand that became an internationally famous duel in which Cody scalped this Indian. A lot of stories about Cody and about his exploits as an Indian slayer. But one of the realities, and I'm going to go back here for a moment, up in the upper right there is a representation of an Indian village. I mentioned that his father traded with Indians. So as a young boy, Will Cody would go to the store where his father was, and he would interact with Indians, both adult Indians and young boys his own age. And as he interacted with them more and more, the Indian boys would invite him to come and do things with them. They taught him how to ride a pony, Indian style, taught him how to use a bow and arrow, taught him how to hunt with it, taught him some of their games like lacrosse and so forth, taught him their language. So far from being desirous of being somebody who saw Indians as the enemy, William F. Cody, as a young boy, actually saw them as friends and spent years interacting with them and learning how to exist with them. That's much different than the image of the Indian slayer. Certainly when he became a scout for the army, he learned that the Indians were the villains, and he was very active in scouting on expeditions where they would go out looking for Indians or trying to fend off Indians that had been ambush parties or so forth. And he received a Congressional Medal of Honor for his exploits in the Indian Wars. But that masks a reality about who William F. Cody was. Here's another quick story for you. This is told by an Army officer in 1889, who was at back in the mid-1870s when this story is set, was at an officers club in Fort Davenport, near, it's on an island between Davenport, Iowa, and Rock Island, Illinois. And he and the other officers were talking about scouting and about the way that scouts acted toward the Indians, and they started talking about that duel with Yellow Hair, where Cody had scalped this Indian. And one of the officers said, "Cody ought not to scalp." He said, "It is all right enough for the Indians to scalp. They know no better. But Cody ought to be above such things." The scout who was being criticized was standing in the doorway, and though he could not be seen by the inmates of the room, yet he heard every word that was said. As the speaker concluded, Cody walked into the room. He certainly was a picture. His tall, lithe, muscular figure was set off by a gorgeous suit of black velvet twinned with gold braid. His long golden hair hung below his shoulders. In a belt at his waist, 2 Colt revolvers and a hunting knife reposed. His complexion was, as it ever has been, since I first met him on the plains, so pink and as white and as feckless as a blooming maiden's of 18 summers. I think the manufacturers of many different kinds of soaps, washes, and lotions could do a great stroke of business by getting Cody to endorse them, because he was so clean-shaven. Well, he strode into the room, looked at the officers, and said, "Gentlemen, I want you to understand one thing. The Honorable William F. Cody does not scalp Indians, but when I am on the plains, I am Buffalo Bill, and Buffalo Bill scalps them every time." So he himself was saying, there is this character, Buffalo Bill, and when I'm being Buffalo Bill, I'm expected to act as Buffalo Bill acts. But in real life, that's not who I am. I'm the Honorable William F. Cody. I'm somebody who grew up interacting with Indians, and I think that they deserve to be treated with respect. Cody became an actor in 1872 and spent 13 years touring with his theatrical company before starting Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which then toured for another 30 years. So roughly 43 years in the show business. And almost that entire time, he interacted with Indians. He made them actors in his theatrical company. He made them performers in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. That drawing on the left is from about 1895, showing him taking a roll call of Indians in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Well, what was in it for the Indians? Why would they do this? Well, if you know anything about American history during this time period, when Indians were put onto the reservation under U.S. government policy, they were required to give up essentially everything that made them Indians. They had to give up their clothing. They had to give up their costume. They had to give up their culture. They were not allowed to speak. The children were taught English. They essentially were forbidden from using their heritage. Well, Cody, in developing Buffalo Bill's Wild West, wanted things to be authentic. He wanted people to really see what the West was like. And so when he brought Indians into his performances, he expected, in fact, he required, that they show their heritage, that they wear their native costume, that they live the way that they had before the reservation days. And so the Indians lived in teepees in the camps that traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. They ate meals, they prepared meals the way they had. The Indian women took care of their children the way they had before the reservation days. They used their language, they danced ceremonial dances, and in fact, with upwards of 30 nations represented in Buffalo Bill's Wild West and difficulty understanding one another with everybody speaking different languages, it was the Lakota Sioux who taught the other performers to be able to communicate using sign language. So Cody, gave them the opportunity to celebrate and reaffirm their heritage, and they treated him with respect because of the way he treated them. On the right is an artifact in our collection. It's a vest. It was made for Cody, a buckskin vest made for him and embroidered for him by Native American performers with Buffalo Bill's Wild West as kind of a tribute of their respect for him. So, back up again. William F. Cody is a scout in 1869, scouting in Kansas and Nebraska with the Army. One day he goes on a scouting party, and along with them is a man named Ezra Zane Carroll Judson, which is a real mouthful. In fact, that man had changed his name to Ned Buntline, and he became an author. And among other things, he wrote dime novels. He wrote stories. He'd been hired by a newspaper in New York to go out to the West and write stories about the West for people to read back east. Well, Buntline initially wanted Wild Bill Hickok to be the hero of his stories, but Hickok wouldn't let him use his name. So Buntline himself is out there scouting for the right person, and he meets Buffalo Bill. And sure enough, in December of 1869, in New York newspapers and then in newspapers around the country, Ned Buntline's great story, The Great Living Scout, Buffalo Bill, the King of Bordermen, the wildest, truest story Ned Buntline ever wrote. Actually, it wasn't really true. A lot of it was just fanciful. But it started a trajectory. It started a course for the nickname that Buffalo Bill had acquired by hunting bison for railroad workers in Kansas. Started that character, that nickname becoming a character. It's kind of like in the times that some of us remember, back in the mid-1950s, a British author wrote an article in a magazine called Argosy, wrote a story in a magazine called Argosy about a British secret agent named James Bond. And the response to the story was so great that Fleming began writing novels about James Bond. And the novels became books, novels became movies. And ultimately, that James Bond figure became a flesh and blood character who we all know today, even though that was a fictional character. He seems somehow larger than life. Well, the dime novels, the stories, and then plays about Buffalo Bill made him a character, made him a heroic figure, and not only in this country, but also in Europe, because the stories were reprinted all through Europe. So William F. Cody finds himself becoming more and more Buffalo Bill. Now, about the same time, he met a woman in St. Louis, Missouri by the name of Louisa Frederici. So it was right after the Civil War. That's her on the right. And they got married in 1866, built a little house in Kansas, and that was their first home. This is a painting that Louisa did of that first house. Probably not the best idea for the two of them to get married. They turned out to be very different people. She came from kind of a well-to-do background in St. Louis, kind of a middle-class family, a family that loved art and music. She was very domestic. Here she marries this guy who is used to spending his life on the plains. You know, he doesn't want to be indoors. He wants to be outdoors, roaming around and hunting and kind of doing as he pleases. But they got married. And soon they had a family. And 4 children, as it turned out. There's a photograph of some of them there, and on the right is a census return that shows some of them. And as most children would be towards their father, his children loved him. You know, it's pretty cool having a father who is a celebrity. This is a picture, we're not sure which one of the daughters did this, but it's maybe Arda or Irma doing this picture of her father as Buffalo Bill on his horse. There's his son, Kit Cody. Young Kit Cody was 5 years old when he contracted scarlet fever in 1876. William F. Cody was being Buffalo Bill. He was on stage in Springfield, Massachusetts. His family was back in Rochester, New York. In the middle of the play, he got a telegram. He stepped off stage to read it, and it said that his son was dying. He finished up the play as quickly as he could, caught a train back to Rochester, got back home in time to have his 5-year-old boy say, "Papa," and then die in his arms. It was, as you imagine, a heartbreaking tragedy for him and for his wife to lose the angel of their eyes. And the letter on the right, it's a little hard to see, but that letter is Cody's letter to his sister Julia, talking about how our angel Kit has been taken from us. There's no question that it haunted him for the rest of his life. Forever after that, every time he was in Rochester or nearby Rochester, he would go visit Kit's grave. He always wanted a son, and he never had another son. He had several daughters, but never a son, but it really did haunt him for the rest of his life, losing his little boy. But not only that, losing 2 other children, too. His daughter, Ora, died in 1883 at the end of William F. Cody's first season with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Literally, a few days after this very successful season ends, he finds out that his 11-year-old daughter, Ora, has died. And in 1904, he learns that his beloved daughter, Arda, who was really the angel, true angel of his eyes, who had gone with him to England, to Paris, had traveled with him through Europe, had been his social secretary, if you will, that Arda had died in 1904. And it was devastating. As you can imagine losing 3 of your children like that. Well, William F. Cody died in 1917. Louisa Cody lived until 1922 and 1923, but in 1918, their last daughter, their last child, Irma, for whom the Irma Hotel is named, she died. So Louisa Cody, at the age of 70, having outlived all of her children, finds herself having to care for 3 little grandchildren. Imagine that. I mean, that's just a real tragedy. She's often comes across as a shrew, but I think she's a woman of tremendous character and courage. As I said, the Codys had a very troubled marriage. I think certainly the deaths of their children, and each of them grieving in their own ways, trying to cope with this, not being able to help one another cope with it, that was hard. The fact that he was gone so much was hard. We have letters from Louisa talking about her loneliness when the Colonel is off being Buffalo Bill. By the mid-1880s, they had pretty much become estranged. They weren't living together. He had a ranch in North Platte, Nebraska. He built a house for Louisa in downtown North Platte, but he very seldom lived under the same roof as her. And as he says in this telegram from the mid-1890s, "The ranch is yours, take it all." He essentially decided he didn't want to be part of her life anymore or have him be part of hers. And in 1904, shortly after Arda's death, he filed for divorce. She accused him of he accused her of trying to poison him. She accused him of having had a series of affairs. It's hard to tell what the truth was in some of this. It was a very sordid, very highly publicized trial that lasted about 2 weeks. All the newspapers covered it. And in the end, the court essentially sided with Louisa, but awarded her $300. And when it ended, Cody couldn't bring himself to follow through on the divorce. In fact, he'd lost the divorce case, so he couldn't divorce her. But it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And a newspaper in San Francisco published a poem, the last stanza of which was this: "Buffalo Bill, we take it ill that you should so unbridle and take a jump and like a chump become a fallen idol." He truly had become this fallen idol. You know, this very public man finding his life turned upside down and inside out. But they reconciled in 1910, largely because of Irma's children, and they wanted to see their grandparents together. So in 1910, they got back together. He presented her with a gold bracelet as a token of his love. The truth is, they really never had stopped loving one another. They had a tremendous affection for one another. And in the end, she was one of the few people who stood by him, one of the very few people to be with William F. Cody until the end. So, the Showman. I mentioned he had this theatrical career that lasted 13 years before he started Buffalo Bill's Wild West. There's no question that at that point, the persona Buffalo Bill and the individual William F. Cody were pretty much one and the same. They traveled throughout North America with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, made countless trips through thousands and thousands of communities, large and small, from 1883 to 1913. And in Europe, made 3 trips to Europe and became a sensation. Literally, as the cartoon on the left suggests, was lionized by Britain. He captured the Lion of Britain. He captured their attention. Everybody who was anybody wanted to meet Buffalo Bill. Likewise, when he went to Paris in 1889, he took Paris by storm, took Rome by storm, took all the cities in Europe that he visited by storm. Everybody wanted to meet Buffalo Bill. And he unarguably was, by the mid-1890s, at the peak of his career, the best-known person in the world. There was nobody else like him. Buffalo Bill's Wild West went, as I said, to North America, to Europe. By around 1910, through movies, films of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, he was being seen, if not in person, in theaters in Asia, throughout Asia, and in Australia and New Zealand and South America. He really was an international celebrity. The first true international superstar, the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. Nobody really knew what celebrity was. Cody, in some ways, helped invent celebrity. And it was not an easy road for him. You know, the pressures of being a public figure, we see in our time figures like Britney Spears, Tiger Woods, Brad Pitt, Amy Winehouse, who died last week. You know, these very public figures whose lives we follow. We seem to want to know every intimate detail of their lives. We put them under a microscope and we hold them up to the standard of conduct. You know, imagine yourself being in that situation. William F. Cody, as Buffalo Bill, there was no guidebook for him, no book that said this is how you behave as a celebrity. He drank heavily. I think, again, the deaths of his children certainly helped account for that. He gambled. He had bouts of depression. And in some ways, the best known person in the world was also the loneliest person in the world. I mean, this to me is one of the most haunting images I've seen of him, looking there out at the arena. But the loneliness that he feels in that tent, that was his home. I mean, that really was the only home he had at this point. He had very few friends. He had business associates, but he really had nobody other than his sister Julia, who he would send these long letters to. He had no friends. He was estranged from his wife, estranged from his children, the ones that were still alive. It had to be a terrible, terrible life for him. I think it is time to quit and take a rest. He's like a tumbleweed, tumbling along. You know, he's been in the public light for 40 years. And as first the head of a theatrical company that performs plays about Buffalo Bill, and as the star of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, that's what everybody's coming to see. You know, they don't want to see Joe Blow being Buffalo Bill. They want to see William F. Cody being Buffalo Bill. He can't take a vacation. They're on the road 150, 200 days a year. He's got to be the star. He's also the manager, the director, day in, day out. He really was like a tumbleweed, kind of drifting along. What does life mean? Is this what I want? Is this all there is to it? The West pulled to him. There's no question. He turns out to be somebody who had this very deep, almost spiritual relationship with nature. And in an interview in 1892 in England, he says, "I was born on the frontier, and that's what I want to get back to. I want to ride my horse on the plains, not in the arena. I want to look my mother nature in the face again and shake hands with her in her own home." This, in a nutshell, this is it. This is a photograph taken in 1901. And it says, "The life I love, camp, head of Shoshone River, Wyoming, November 21st, 1901, W.F. Cody." That's the life he loved. The life, the wild with a small w, the wilderness West, the West of forests and mountains and streams and hunting and fishing. It's not the life of the showman in the arena. He didn't sign it Buffalo Bill with a picture of himself on a big horse. This is the life he loved. And the West is pulling to him. It really is pulling to him. And so he starts wanting to come back to the West. After being all over the world, he wants to come back to what he truly knows. So he starts a ranch, first in Nebraska and then here in Wyoming, about 35 miles south of here, the T.E. Ranch. It's still there today. Takes up cattle ranching and raising thoroughbred horses. Likes that as much time as he's got to spend there, but the biggest problem he had was every time he's traveling with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, that all the green stuff, all the greenery on that farm, all that ranch, he doesn't see it. He gets back there in October, November, when everything's dry and brown and dead. And it drives him nuts. He's spent all this money developing this ranch, and he hardly ever gets back there to it. The place that he loved the most, he truly loved the most in the world, was that ranch, and he hardly can spend any time there. He realizes he can't just walk away from Buffalo Bill's Wild West because he's got to have an income. You know, some years the show is making $1 million, and he's making all this money. Well, what's he going to do to replace it? He says, "There's a barrel of money out there, and I'm after the barrel." He's determined to find ways to make himself rich. So he starts looking for opportunities for things to invest in that he hopes will one day give him the opportunity to strike it rich and make it as big as he's been able to do with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. How many of you recognize that photograph there? How many of you have seen The Honeymooners? You know, The Honeymooners, it's pretty much the same story over and over again. Ralph has some great scheme he's cooked up that's going to make himself rich. And I mean, this classic line, "Baby, this is the biggest thing I ever got into." And Alice says, no, Ralph, the biggest thing you ever got into was your pants. You know, she's always crushing his dreams. Well, William F. Cody had that same kind of dream. And this line that he says in a letter to his nephew, Frank Cody, he says, Frank, this looks like about the best thing I ever got into. He was always looking after one scheme or another, whether it was buying millions of acres of land in northern Mexico to colonize it, or setting up a huge game preserve along the north rim of the Grand Canyon, or developing an artificial coffee beverage called Panamalt that lasted about 6 months before they realized, hey, nobody likes this stuff, or whether it was one other kind of scheme, whether it was gold mines or copper mines or whatever. He opened up gold mines in Arizona, and he spent literally millions of dollars trying to make this mine and copper mines in Wyoming work. He tells this wonderful story in a letter to his sister, Julia, I think. The great thing about having a gold mine is whenever you want some money, you just send somebody down to get you some gold. Well, it didn't work out that way for him. He had some unscrupulous partners who essentially would go down and seed this mine, which is pretty much a barren hole. They'd put some gold down there, or they'd send him gold jewelry with nuggets of gold on it and say, look what's down there. We just got to get some more money. We got to get some more mining equipment. We got to pay some more workers. We got to hire some more people. So he's just signing one check after another, $20,000 here, $50,000 there, and it begins to add up. And over the course of 15 years, he lost probably $1 to $2 million on mining ventures. So the West is beckoning to him. He's having trouble making ends meet. He had visited Wyoming. We're not sure entirely when. By one account, it's the early 1870s. By another account, it's the early 1890s. But regardless, he goes to the Bighorn Basin. I don't know if any of you on your way out here went through Lovell and the Bighorn Canyon, but near Lovell, Wyoming, is Medicine Wheel, which is it's a sacred medicine wheel, Native American remains. Well, across the road from that, almost where you pull off, is a turnout. And when you stand there, that picture is what you see. You're looking out over what looks like one of the biggest holes in the world. Just this godforsaken, desolate area. It's hard to imagine anything there. It just looks vast and empty. A lot of people saw that vast and empty spot. William F. Cody looked at it and he had a vision. He had a vision of that becoming a settled area. He says, my whole aim in life is to open this new country and settle it with happy and prosperous people and thus leave behind a landmark of something attempted, something done, finally something done, something that he can point to as being tangible. And as he said in a letter, when I'm finished, I'll be remembered. And so he sets about, from 1896 onward, trying to make that vision happen. Sets up a company, the Shoshone Land and Irrigation Company, to help settle this area. And more importantly, to develop canals and irrigation systems to help make the desert bloom so that there can be agriculture here. He starts promoting and himself investing in mineral resources, oil, coal, clay, other resources that are here. And he starts promoting tourism, the development of railroads and highways and hotels between here and Yellowstone, and that would become a mecca for tourism. And, oh, by the way, in 1896, he and some other men form a town site company and begin developing a town which we know today as Cody. And this is a contemporary map, a map of today, showing his vision realized. The area between Lovell and Yellowstone, the Bighorn Basin to the east and Yellowstone to the west, it hasn't filled in the way he envisioned it totally. You know, he had aspirations of this becoming like Denver North, with maybe upwards of 500,000 people living here. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. There's probably, on a good day, maybe 150,000. But there's irrigation here. It's the lifeblood of agriculture here as he envisioned. There are towns here. There is certainly tourism here. And there are minerals here. And in fact, even now, we're beginning to re-exploit some of the very fields that he himself had helped open. So, as he waves goodbye, and as I say thank you, I hope you'll have a different image in mind of William F. Cody. His philosophy in life, as he expressed it, boiled down to something very simple. I can and I will. Will, I think, came right out of his favorite nickname for himself. It was not Buffalo Bill, it was Will Cody. But I can and I will. If I set my mind to do something, I can get it done. Well, the thing he most wanted to do was what he got done. To build a town here and to be remembered for something that would benefit society far more than being remembered only as Buffalo Bill. Well, thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Be happy to answer any questions if anybody has them.